Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by R.J. Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
Welcome to the debate. So picture a moment. You are scrolling through a feed and you just stop dead in your tracks.
Right. We've all been there.
Exactly. You're confronted by this truly stunning piece of visual art, or, maybe a deeply moving essay or a remarkably composed piece of music. It demands your attention. It stirs something inside you. And then you glance down at the very first comment posted mere seconds after the work was published. It just reads, quote, AI trash.
Yeah, and the spell shatters instantly. The whole conversation pivots entirely from what the art actually means to whether or not the art is real.
That exact pivot is, it's the focal point of today's intellectual exchange. We are dissecting R.J. Starr's seminal essay, The Costume Changes, the Reflex Does Not, which is a foundational text from his broader structural archive, The Artificial Era.
It's a fantastic piece of writing.
It really is. Starr puts forward a deeply provocative thesis regarding this modern reflex to accuse high-quality works of being machine-made. He argues that this accusation has almost nothing to do with the technology itself and, everything to do with human frailty.
And it is a fascinating framework. Starr is attempting to map out the psychological architecture behind why we so eagerly dismiss excellence by labeling it artificial.
I will be representing the position today that Starr is entirely correct in his assessment. The accusation of artificiality is fundamentally a psychological defense mechanism. It's a timeless reflex that observers use to avoid the profound vulnerability and, frankly, the ambiguity of a genuinely moving encounter.
And I will be representing the contrasting perspective, because while Starr's psychological framework of avoidance offers brilliant insights into human defensive behavior, completely dismissing the specific technological reality of our time, what Starr calls the costume, it ignores the very real material demands of evaluating authenticity in the modern era.
Let us establish the core premise of Starr's argument, which really hinges on an observation about time. Starr asserts that the speed is the tell.
The speed of the comet, you mean?
Right. When an observer instantly dismisses a striking image or a beautifully coherent argument as being AI-generated, that dismissal is not the product of an investigation. It is a reflex that precedes thought. And Starr explains that this reflex is driven by an intense, almost physical intolerance of ambiguity. Consider the cognitive mechanics of what it means to be moved by an artifact. To be struck by a photograph or persuaded by a poignant paragraph means you have let something external enter your internal world.
Sure, you are being, in Starr's words, acted upon. That state requires exposure. You are undefended.
Right, you are in a state of reception rather than a state of evaluation.
Exactly.
Let me offer an analogy to visualize this. Imagine you are sitting in a darkened theater. The lead actor is delivering this devastating, emotionally raw monologue.
Okay.
The music swells, the lighting shifts perfectly, and right at the exact moment you feel a lump forming in your throat, the person next to you leans over and loudly whispers, "Hey, you can see the wire holding up that piece of scenery."
Oh, wow. Yeah, totally ruining the moment.
Completely. They did not engage with the tragedy of the play. They pointed out the rigging. They do this because the instant claim of, "This is fake," or "A machine made this," transforms them from a vulnerable, undefended observer into a protected judge.
It relocates control.
Yes. Just like that cynical theater critic pointing out the wire to a Lloyd crying in public, the accusation of artificiality is a maneuver designed to foreclose the open-ended, often uncomfortable formation of meaning.
Well, I will say the explanatory power of Starr's psychological architecture in mapping that specific defensive maneuver is robust. I actually find his concept of the identity dividend particularly illuminating here.
The social reward aspect?
Exactly. Think about the listener's own experience scrolling online. If you have ever felt that little rush of satisfaction when you spot a slightly mangled hand in a digital painting, or like a repetitive cadence in an article, ask yourself what dividend you just paid yourself.
Right.
We exist in a cultural ecosystem that prizes the detection of fakery. By instantly claiming something is machine-made, the observer performs a socially rewarded sophistication. They announce to the room, I am above this. I was not fooled.
Yeah, it's very performative.
It is. And they reap the social status of a discerning critic without undertaking the laborious, time-consuming work of actual discernment. It is a very seductive posture.
It is an effortless elevation of the self at the expense of the work.
Right. But my counter-thesis, however, is that Starr's insistence on treating this reflex as entirely identical to historical misattributions goes a step too far.
How so?
Well, Starr himself notes in the essay that, quote, there are contexts in which the origin of an artifact matters a great deal. By reducing the accusation purely to an inability to tolerate ambiguity, Starr risks pathologizing a behavior that is, in the artificial era, a profoundly necessary heuristic.
A heuristic for what exactly?
For navigating a flooded, polluted information landscape. Treating the skepticism of the modern observer purely as an involuntary psychological flinch fundamentally dismisses the rational adaptation of the human mind. We are in an environment where machines are in fact generating an enormous volume of our media.
Okay, but let us look closely at the nature of the discomfort that triggers this heuristic. Starr is arguing that what observers truly cannot tolerate is not the machine itself.
Then what is it?
The cognitive distress comes from the unresolved state of not knowing where to place an artifact. When you encounter something that is too coherent, too finished, or too striking, and it does not neatly fit your expectations of reality, the brain experiences tension. Cognitive dissonance.
Sure.
The reflex to call it artificial is simply an emergency exit from that vulnerability. The concept of AI or the machine is just a convenient bucket to drop the unresolved encounter into. Once it is in the bucket, the tension resolves. You no longer have to sit with the discomfort of the unknown.
Well, I come at it from a different way. Starr draws an incredibly sharp boundary between two types of people. He separates the careful person who examines a work, notices the distinct marks of automated production, and concludes through evidence that it is machine-made, from the person who simply reflexes to avoid emotional discomfort. But out in the wild, that boundary is a fiction. Starr says an encounter with a genuine work is an occasion for meaning. I accept that premise. But the observer's defensive posture is a rational response to an environment where the very foundations of that meaning are actively being counterfeited.
Counterfeited, sure, but
Think of it like a cognitive immune system. If a biological immune system encounters a novel virus, it builds antibodies. The next time it encounters something even vaguely resembling that virus, it attacks aggressively. It's an epistemic shield.
an epistemic shield.
Yes. If the currency of meaning is being systematically debased by mass automation, then a hypervigilant, hair-trigger defense mechanism is not just a cowardly refusal of vulnerability. It is a protective measure against an infection of fake meaning. You cannot ask a person to leave themselves open to be acted upon by a profound piece of art if there's a highly probable statistical chance that the art is a synthetic simulation designed to manipulate their emotions.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. If it were truly about authenticity, if it were genuinely a rational epistemic shield functioning as you suggest, the accuser's behavior would look fundamentally different.
How so?
Well, an immune system analyzes the threat. A careful person investigates. They would look for the telltale signs, they would pause, they would, do the labor of discernment. Instead, what is the actual behavior we observe?
The instant comment.
Yes, they deliver a verdict instantly. The speed is what betrays the motive. If you are protecting the foundation of meaning, you take the time to evaluate the foundation. If you are just trying to escape the visceral feeling of being moved, you throw out the fastest conversation-ending culprit available.
But you are assuming that speed precludes rationality. In a high-velocity information environment, speed is a survival mechanism.
But the mechanism they are using to survive is structurally identical to the superstitions of the past. This is why Starr's historical lineage is so vital to understanding the phenomenon. He traces his behavior back centuries. Consider the healer.
Okay.
When a medieval community with no framework for effective medicine saw a woman saving lives with herbs and interventions, her competence deeply unsettled them. It did not fit their categories.
Right.
The mind cannot hold that irregularity, so it supplies a fast, closed category. She is a witch. Or, when a comet appeared unpredictably in the sky, disrupting the notion of an ordered heavens, it produced psychological distress. That distress was resolved by assigning it a meaning, an omen foretelling a king's death.
Uh-huh.
And when the early anatomist finally understood the interior mechanisms of the human body, exceeding the theological categories of his peers, he was accused of unholy traffic with the dead.
I know exactly where you're taking this.
The structure across all these centuries is mathematically identical. A failure to fit existing categories produces discomfort. That discomfort is immediately resolved by assigning a fast, conversation-ending culprit. Witchcraft, omen, unholy transgression. Today, when a person encounters an undeniable masterpiece that doesn't fit their understanding of a digital creator's supposed limits, they invoke the modern culprit, the machine.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the definitional precision of this historical lineage? Because there is a fundamental ontological difference here that Starr entirely glosses over.
Ontological difference?
Yes. The healer, the comet, and the anatomist were instances of natural or human truths that simply exceeded the ignorant categories of their time. The comet was a real physical celestial body of rock and ice. The anatomist was uncovering actual human biology.
Sure.
The community was misattributing a natural reality to a supernatural fiction because they lacked the scientific tools to understand it.
Which is precisely what people do now when they misattribute human genius to an algorithmic prompt.
Not at all. The modern machine-made artifact is fundamentally different. It is an engineered simulation of human coherence. The witch's magic wasn't real. The machine is real. The costume, as Starr dismissively calls it, matters far more today because the machine actually exists, and it actually creates these artifacts by the millions.
I mean, yes, it creates volume, but...
When a villager called a healer a witch, they were invoking a non-existent mechanism to explain a reality. When a modern observer calls an image artificial, they are invoking a highly capable mechanism that is actively producing content on the exact platform they are using. You simply cannot equate a medieval superstition with a highly probable material reality. The historical analogy is beautiful prose, but structurally, it collapses under the weight of the actual functioning technology we interact with today.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. The analogy doesn't collapse because the reality of the mechanism isn't what matters to the psychological reflex. Starr addresses this head-on.
How?
He points out that the people making these accusations today are rarely ignorant of the technology. In fact, they are often fluent in it. They know the machine is real, but the function of the accusation remains identical to the villager yelling witch. The goal is not scientific categorization. The goal is closing the encounter.
Closing the encounter.
Yes. Let me pose a scenario to test this. If the modern observer is acting rationally based on the high probability of machine generation, as you argue, why are they so universally immune to counter evidence?
You are referring to the phenomenon where creators attempt to prove their authorship.
Yes. Starr meticulously observes the strange durability of this dismissal. A human artist with decades of demonstrated craft produces a masterpiece. The accusation arrives instantly. This is machine-made. Then, the artist provides empirical proof.
Right.
They upload the sketches, the raw files, the time lapses showing hours of meticulous brushstrokes. And what happens? The accuser rarely, if ever, concedes.
They double down.
Exactly. They claim the time lapse is faked, or they shift the goalposts and attack the artist's style for being too generic. Why the refusal to accept empirical proof? Because, as Starr brilliantly puts it, the accuser is not defending a belief, they are defending an exit.
Defending an exit.
To look at the counter-evidence, to genuinely acknowledge the human authorship, would require them to re-enter the very encounter they just fled. It would require them to be vulnerable to the emotional weight of the art again. The counter-evidence is unwelcome because it undoes the psychological protection the dismissal provided.
Well, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are going to argue that they ignore the time lapses because their internal fragility cannot handle the emotional vulnerability of the artwork.
Yes.
But I argue that is an overly sanitized, purely psychological reading of what is actually a ruthless sociological dynamic. We have to look at the social incentives of the platforms where this occurs. If the culture heavily rewards the posture of judgment, that identity dividend we discussed earlier, then the refusal to look at counter-evidence is not about a fear of profound meaning. It is a social entrenchment.
You see it as a preservation of status.
Entirely. Think of it like political tribalism or the cognitive dissonance you see in certain ideological groups when a core prediction fails. Conceding that you are wrong when presented with the artist's sketchpad means giving up the high ground of the discerning, unfoolable critic.
Which is painful.
Right. It means publicly admitting you were duped, which is the ultimate cardinal sin in a high deception environment. Starr wants to treat the accusation merely as an involuntary account of the accuser's own fears of being moved. But it is much more calculating than that. The accuser ignores the counter-evidence because accepting it costs them social capital.
Well, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it stops halfway down the causal chain. You have to ask why the culture rewards that specific posture of judgment. Why does the culture grant social capital to the cynic over the enthusiast?
Okay.
It traces back to the same psychological architecture. The culture itself is terrified of ambiguity. Society rewards the cynic because the cynic promises safety. But let me challenge you on the practical application of this debate. Doesn't Starr's framing offer the only productive way forward for the creator and the observer alike?
In what sense?
Think about the escalating arms race of proof. If we engage with the costume, if we constantly argue about the technology, providing endless proofs of human origin, holding up raw files to the crowd, we feed the conflict.
That's true. It never ends.
Exactly. We validate the accuser's premise that the origin is the only thing that matters, and we enter a never-ending trial where the artist is presumed guilty. But if we recognize the body beneath the costume, the underlying fear of ambiguity and the defense mechanism at play, the claim loses its power to provoke. We stop trying to prove our humanity to someone who is just using a reflex to avoid feeling anything.
It is certainly a more peaceful paradigm for the artist to adopt, I'll give you that. Starr writes profoundly about the discipline required to attend to the reflex rather than the claim. It turns the accusation from a hostile attack to be repelled into a psychological specimen to be examined.
Right.
From the perspective of the creator, treating a hostile comment as someone who is simply unable to stay in front of the work is a brilliant mechanism for preserving one's sanity. It drains the venom out of the interaction entirely.
It is an act of profound empathy. Starr calls it an involuntary account of what they could not stay in front of. It is a tragic way to look at the accuser, really. In their desperate attempt to maintain control, they are systematically depriving themselves of meaning.
They are. However, my central contention remains firm. While we should absolutely attend to the reflex, we must not lose our grip on the reality of the claim. If we universally adopt Starr's discipline, if we collectively decide that every accusation of artificiality is just a psychological refusal of meaning, we surrender our ability to critique the technology itself.
You think it gives a free pass?
Yes. We risk giving a free pass to actual automated mediocrity by treating all skepticism as a psychological defect of the viewer. The anatomist's knowledge became the foundation of modern medicine, and his critics were historically wrong. But if the anatomist had actually been a grave robber assembling a Frankenstein monster, the critics would have been entirely justified in their horror.
The premise of your concern assumes Starr is instructing us to abandon the evaluation of reality. He explicitly guards against this early in the essay.
He does?
Yes. He states clearly that the question of whether a thing is machine-made is a real question. It is sometimes answerable, and it often matters a great deal to the context of the work. The thesis is not that technology is irrelevant. It is that the reflexive dismissal is irrelevant. He separates the slow labor of inquiry from the rapid flinch of avoidance.
But
As I mentioned, that separation is cleaner in the sterile environment of an essay than in the chaotic practice of daily life. When a listener is scrolling through a timeline, rapidly consuming vast quantities of information, they do not have the luxury of time for the slow, methodical labor of judgment. The rapid heuristic, the reflex, is often the only tool available to them.
If the rapid heuristic is the only tool you employ, and that heuristic is structurally designed to foreclose meaning the moment it detects ambiguity, then you are navigating the world by systematically cutting yourself off from anything that might challenge or move you.
That's a fair point.
That is the tragedy Starr is desperately pointing out. If you swipe past a genuine, soul-stirring piece of human expression because your heuristic falsely flagged its excellence as artificial, you haven't merely made a categorization error. You have successfully protected yourself from the open-endedness of an experience that hadn't yet resolved into a neat box. You have built a fortress, but you have locked yourself inside it, completely shielded from art.
I concede that the cost of an overactive heuristic is undeniably high. The loss of meaning is a heavy toll to pay for the illusion of control. And that is where Starr's integration of the meaning domain in his framework achieves such potency.
Yes.
The idea that to truly remain in an encounter is to let meaning form on its own timeline, and that this requires patience and a relinquishing of control, that is a beautiful articulation of how we must engage with art and with human complexity in general.
And the reflexive attribution of artificiality violently short-circuits that formation. Once an artifact is filed into the category of a machine output, there is nothing left to feel. The encounter is dead.
Yes, and I think this is where our positions actually find significant convergence. We both agree that Starr's identification of the identity dividend serves as a vital, urgent critique of contemporary cultural discourse. The effortless, socially rewarded performance of spotting fakery is a modern epidemic. We are actively breeding a culture of cynical critics who prize the safety of not being fooled over the profound risk of being genuinely moved.
Absolutely. We have constructed an entire social ecosystem that rewards the theater critic for aggressively pointing out the wires, while mocking the audience member who allows themselves to be brought to tears by the performance.
Because the costume of the artificial era poses real existential questions about human authorship that the Comets and anatomists of history never did. I fully agree that we must become hyper-aware of our own psychological architecture. We have a responsibility to ask ourselves, am I dismissing this piece of work because I have actual evidence it is an automated simulation, or am I dismissing it because its unexplainable excellence makes me feel vulnerable and uncomfortable?
That is the exact discipline Starr calls for at the conclusion of the essay. He challenges us to allow the accusation to fade while the true work remains. As he notes with such clarity, the healer went on healing. The comet went on being a comet. The anatomist's truth survived the rumors of unholy transgressions. The true work survives the reflex.
It is a profound and demanding framework. Starr's broader archive on psychological architecture provides a lens that extends far beyond just AI or technological disruption. It challenges how we form defenses against meaning across every domain of our lives.
It does. It suggests that to be truly human in any era, whether artificial or deeply organic, requires the immense courage to stay in the room with ambiguity, to allow yourself to be acted upon without instantly reaching for the shield of judgment. So the next time you find yourself in that darkened theater and you feel the overwhelming urge to look up and spot the wires holding up the scenery, ask yourself what it is you are really trying to avoid.
Because the costume changes, but the reflex does not.
A question worth sitting with, even if the answer makes us profoundly uncomfortable.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by R.J. Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.